A Kitsune in Remnant by Red Devil 360, Chapter 19, The Bloody Fox. Naruto, dressed in his Anbu gear, treaded through base camp as rain pelted down from above, turning the muddy ground into a swampy mess. All around him, shinobi, samurai, and standard footmen ran about to their jobs in a mass showcase of chaos. Nobody paid attention to him, which he was thankful for, especially after the news they just received. Everyone was more troubled with the break in their defense line. Thoroughly soaked, he entered the command tent where most of the leaders of the war effort had gathered. Heads turned when he entered, and the faces of the five Kages and several high-ranking officials from the main army stared back at him. He bowed his head shortly in greeting and walked up to the table where a map of the continent was displayed. Commander, thank you for coming. I assume the news you bring isn't good, Tsunade greeted with a grim look. I'm afraid not, Hokage-sama, Nato replied, refraining from calling her Bachan. The defenses have been fully breached in the land of rivers. My Ambu report a vanguard of 10,000 advanced through, with more being assembled as we speak. They have a direct path straight into the heart of the nations. Already the daimyo of Rivers has announced his capitulation to the invaders, and several more minors are likely to follow, such as Mountain Bear and Fang, who were already under threat. Just the land of Rivers folding puts a fire and wind countries under threat. If more follow, we could be looking at a total collapse of the elemental nations, Gara murmured. Do we have anything to move in the way? May questioned. One of the generals shook their head. I'm afraid not. We're already outnumbered and spread thin across the whole continent. If we move any large number of soldiers, the entire war could collapse, he reported. The best we can do currently is throw parties at their flanks and attempt to slow them down. Another said. The tent became enveloped in silence as the full weight of the situation settled. Eventually, Naruto spoke up with a heavy heart. Perhaps we don't have to send an army, however, but just one man. Eyes turned to him, and he felt their burning scrutiny. What are you saying? A asked gruffly. Naruto closed his eyes and checked slightly before reaching into his pouch and pulling a single kunai on the table. If anything, the silence got heavier, each Kage knowing exactly what the kunai meant. So, boy, you finally figured it out? Onoki practically growled. His contempt for what the kunai represented went unsaid. Enough, he stated simply. Tsunade crossed her arms under her breast, then frowned at the boy. She thought of a grandson. You are aware of what you are risking, correct? You will kill more than your father ever did, she pressed. Are you willing to cast out your humanity? You will never be the same again. Naruto looked at her through his mask and nodded once. It was enough. Very well, Commander. The very fate of the war effort rests on your shoulders, May proclaimed solemnly. Do not fail, because you have no other choice in the matter, A grunted. Naruto somehow stood a little straighter. I need supplies, he requested. How much do you need? Gaara prompted. Naruto turned to him. How much you've got? 10,000 remnant soldiers perched in quick time along a river just outside a large forest that encompassed a land of rivers. And spirits were high after the breakthrough, and many within the ranks were overjoyed at being given the opportunity to drive the first knife into the elemental nation's underbelly. There were, of course, those wary of an ambush along their route. They were exactly being subtle, and ambushes were the shinobi's greatest strength. But many dismissed such ideas. There were many in number, and while shinobi could certainly punch above their weight, there were no significant troop compositions near to threaten them. They were home clear, and the end of the war was in the sight. Eben was an Elysian regular that had been in service for 2 years before the outbreak of the war, and had served faithfully for the duration of it. His first active battle zone was sea country, and his second and third on the outskirts of fire and earth countries. Since then, he'd stayed in the forest, river country as part of a force dedicated to rooting out the river daimyo's forces led by the shinobi in guerrilla tactics. The use of fire dust was prevalent in this. The step by step they drove them out of the forests and to the rivers that the country was known for. The sun was high in the sky and was warm on his face and back, and he enjoyed what was basically a walking through the countryside. It could have been a movie from back home in which the sky darkened suddenly from the metal falling from the sky, hundreds, no thousands of kunai, almost literally blotting out the sun. The large column, caught unawares and with their metaphorical pants down, screamed and yelled in pain as the shinobi trademark pierced bodies and dropped them like flies. Those that survived scrambled to get into some sort of defensible position as they figured out who was attacking them. Had been among them, pushed towards the river, slashing slightly into the surf. Shinobi out in the open were at their weakest. With no aura, they could easily be overwhelmed when numbers were against them, which these ones must certainly be. The kunai barrage, as surprising as it had been, hadn't done much damage. It had only alerted them to their presence. The army split the group up in separate squads and kept their eyes on the woods in front of them, waiting for the shinobi to show themselves. As suddenly as the kunai appeared, so did these yellow flashes intermittently appearing, how horribly among their formations. As soon as one appeared and disappeared, a dozen men would fall, or an explosion would consume a squad. These were so sudden that a flash could appear and reappear among a different group before the first had begun falling. They had never faced something like this throughout the whole war. Shinobi were fast, yes, but this was different. Before they could fight back, perhaps a full futility, they would fight. This was simply a slaughter, and it terrified him. Every flash caused him to flinch, expecting him to be next. Each new group of screams sent a stab of anticipation down his back as he vainly tried predicting where this mysterious killer would strike next. Red. The river ran red. That wasn't right. Water was blue. The grass was red too. It was meant to be green. Why was everything red? He was panicking now. He knew it too. There was nothing he could do to control himself. A heavy presence had settled on his chest. It felt like a beowulf was sitting on it. It made it hard to breathe. He dropped his rifle. When had his hands gone so numb? Not just his hands. His entire body was numb. Were his legs shackled? He couldn't tell. He stepped back and stumbled on a hiding hole in the river, tripping and landing on a chest deep in the water. Or was it blood at this point? But it ultimately saved his life as this time the flash appeared and blinded him. When it was gone, his squad, his friends, family were simply floating in the river, throats slit or hearts pierced, their blood already adding to the devilish concoction he was sitting in. A single kunai caught his eye. It was three-pronged and slightly longer than the standard one shinobi used. The handle was covered in a paper tag with squiggles on it that glowed slightly. Was this it? Was this the source of their downfall? A simple kunai? Ibn looked up from the kunai towards the shore, and his breath caught in his throat. The army, some of the finest soldiers Remnant had to offer, was obliterated. Bodies were floating aimlessly in the river, others were scattered on the shore, killed in all manner of fashions, some simply by a neat line across the throat, more were pierced by upwards of a dozen of the single blade kunai and shuriken. Had he been another man, he'd have thought this some important section in a story made to tear at the reader's heartstrings, but he wasn't, and this was very much real, and he was sick, horrified. Thousands simply dead, and not even the Grim had killed so many so swiftly. What kind of monster, kind of demon, was worse than the Grim? The very being that had caused a ceasefire during a war because they became too big a problem to ignore. Then he saw him, it. He hadn't picked up on him first, thinking him nothing more than a shadow, but the porcelain mask gave it away. It was once white, now it was stained red. Its body was stained red in blood, and it literally dribbled off its blade as he walked softly through the carnage, inspecting his handiwork. Was it out to pride, or was it just being thorough? It paused, and Ibn's heart leapt into his mouth. It was eerie how it turned towards him without making a sound, but the mask of a fox of all things stared back. Who are we, to be brought so low by but a fox, a creature that slinks in the night? Now he was no means a master at sensing people with his aura, but there was no mistaking its presence on the field. It was suffocating. It reeked a foul odor of pure murder and bloodlust. Was it a demon after all? Was any man capable of such destruction without balking? The demon employed or enslaved by the barbarians to unleash on their enemies without hesitation or remorse. The bloody fox. The words came to mind, and it was suddenly all he could think about. He blinked and it was gone, just vanished. Alive he may be, but nearly 10,000 others didn't share his fate. The fox had spared him for a reason, and he wasn't going to look a gift horse in the mouth. He was leaving. He was done with the war, if this was the outcome. Shakingly he got to his feet and said above looking for survivors, "See if any others were as lucky as he to have survived being face to face with a literal demon." News had spread around the camp of Naruto's mission, and the panic that had encompassed it for days had burned out into a cold nervousness. Word had also reached them of two more armies advancing into the land of rivers. Their numbers were unknown, but Naruto said he'd deal with them in a similar manner. This was a week ago, nearly 2 weeks now since the first breach. Now, however, a toad had been sent ahead, and the armies in rivers had been thrown into a complete rout, and Naruto was returning. The five Kage had gathered at the entrance to the camp, patiently awaiting for his return. Jiraiya and Kakashi had also requested to be present to check on the condition of their mutual student. Several dozen other shinobi loitered behind them, pretending to be busy while still being nosy. Half an hour they waited before a figure appeared at the entrance to the camp. They waited with bated breath as the figure slowly revealed itself to be a black-clad Naruto. Black-clad was a stretch. The clothing was steeped in so much blood it seemed to permanently dyed a slight red, as did his mask, the pattern barely visible underneath the caked blood. His was slumped forward and appeared to be almost asleep or walking as he dragged his body through the camp. His ninja-toe hung loosely in his grip, half broken. He stopped in front of the five Kages and knelt, almost toppling over at the process. "Mission accomplished, Kage-samas. Enemy forces in full retreat after two more defeats," he repeated in a small voice. Tsunade nodded softly. "And these defeats, how many did they number?" she asked gently. Naruto was silent for a moment. 18,000 and 24,000 in total, 52,000 losses for remnant forces," he replied finally, so quiet in fact that the five Kages in front of him barely heard him, but they did, and they were quite frankly horrified. A young man, not even into his 20s yet, had slaughtered a minor village's worth of people. Tsunade walked forward and crouched down to Naruto's level, gently reaching up to remove his mask. Some blood had made it past his mask and was dried on his face. Black bags sat underneath his eyes, and his eyes were just dead. The once vibrant pools of blue were darkened and lifeless. Even his whisker marks on his cheeks seemed duller. "Oh, Naruto," she whispered, and raised the manicured hand to his cheek. "Permission to be relieved for some time, Hokage-sama?" he asked, his eyes pleading with her. Tsunade nodded with a mournful smile. "Granted, Naruto-kun. Go get some rest. You of all people deserve it." The shinobi retrieved his mask and disappeared in a shunshin without another word. The female Hokage stood and turned to her counterparts. "Commander Kitsune is relieved of his command for a period yet to be determined. Kakashi, you shall take his place until further notice." The Cyclops nodded. "And someone," she faltered, slightly, "find Inochi. We may have need of his services, if at least to judge his mental state," she ordered heavily. The depths of his mindscape had always been slightly repulsive. Being a sewer, it was kind of a given, even more so when he learned of his prisoner. The large metal bars loomed above and into the darkness, the large seal just waiting to be removed, but he ignored it, and the large red eyes staring at him through the bars. He simply floated above it in the water present in the base of the sewer. Numb. 52,000. The number floated around in his head much like he did. The mechanics of the Hiraishin slowed down the user perception of time during the flash. It allowed them to process and react to everything around the tag in fractions of a second. It meant that he saw and complied every face of those 52,000. 51,890 actually, but what difference did that make? His other kills from before and during the war made up the rest of that number and likely far exceeded it. His status as a Jinchuriki meant he was always on hand when a hammer was needed. As a jailer of the QB, he was their largest one after receiving training from B himself. While learning and refining the Hiraishin for his own use, he had wondered what was going through his father's mind when using the template from the 9 Dim Hokage, Tobira Masenju, to create the jutsu, and then using the to wipe out any Iwa assault in the Third Shinobi War. Was it like what he was feeling now? Who knew? His mother probably made Jiraiya too, but one had long been dead and the other was just not the person to talk to one's feelings about. You're pathetic, you know that? The fox spoke from behind the bars, now to remain silent. So you killed a few thousand meat bags. What's there to get worked up at? If anything, you should be celebrating. The weak die and the strong live. You eliminate the weak and have cemented yourself at the top of the food chain. You'd almost have my respect if you weren't so pathetic yourself, he continued, unperturbed. Naruto grunted. Pathetic? Maybe. I used to think that I could waltz through my shinobi life without taking lives. My early genin career consisted of me talking to people. He chuckled slightly. The talk no jutsu, they called it. Look at me now. The bloody fox, they called me. Appropriate, he murmured. The fox behind the bars shifted slightly, and a large furred head appeared closer to and into the light. You are not arguing, he mused. How can I? Naruto responded. Because you are you, and one of the most stubborn meat bags I have had the displeasure of knowing, but that is worthy of its own brand of strength and respect. Stand tall, brat, you always have and always shall. Naruto's eyes shot open and he darted up in his cot with a sharp intake of breath, the cubist words ringing in his ears. Hey, what did you mean? What was the whole inspirational speech there? He asked in his mind, but no answer came. He huffed and closed his eyes again, but knew that no sleep would come for him. It was trouble enough getting himself calm enough to moderately meditate. He swung his legs around on the cot and opened his eyes, looking intently at his calloused hands. Logically, there wasn't a single drop of blood on them, but he saw it. They were drenched, and there was nothing he could do to clean it. He shook his head and closed the room to a water basin in the corner and splashed his face. Blood again, he growled. Why couldn't he get rid of it? With frustration, sweat at the water, he stalked back to his cot and sat down, throwing his head into his hands with a defeated sigh. Naruto, may I come in? A voice called from his tent flap. Are you going to come in even if I say no? Naruto replied after a beat. Probably, he replied. Then save me the trouble. He allowed moving his head so it was resting on his bridged hands instead. He watched as the tent flaps opened, admitting an Iwa Jonin, still a bit dirty from her last mission. I heard what happened, she said at last. It wasn't. It wasn't what? My fault? Naruto interrupted. 51,890 people. Why would say otherwise, Kurosutsu? He snapped. The woman in question frowned and stepped closer to sit on the cot beside the blonde. Okay, she sighed. Perhaps that was a poor choice of words, but what do you want me to say? Thanks to your actions, the entirety of River Country is now free from remnants' armies. Reports are already saying the assaults around the whole continent have halted. Naruto, you may have single-handedly just won us the war. You're a hero for Kami's sake, she burst out. A hero? Naruto questioned incredulously. No, heroes don't simply slaughter people because they can. It was Naruto's turn to be interrupted this time. Naruto, think of how many lives you saved because those armies who stopped right there and then because of you. You volunteered to do something no one else could do because you could. The amount of lives you saved is so many more times greater, Kurotsuchi implored. Naruto bowed and shook his head. Then why? Why is this haunting me? If all you say is true, then why am I sick of what I have done? He doubted. Kurotsuchi grasped his chin and forced him to look into her eyes. Because that's who you are. You are a wonderful man, with a heart bigger than this world, a world that will never truly deserve it. Naruto pulled himself free and returned to staring at a hole into the opposite wall, clearly not believing her words. Seeing her failure, she sighed and stood to leave, but a hand grabbed her wrist as she did. She turned back to Naruto, but he continued staring at the wall, not saying anything. She got the idea though and sat back down. Okay, I'll stay. She understood, locking fingers with him. End of chapter 19.